Welcome, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to join us for this session. My name is Hilda Perez, and I will be your host for this webinar. Before we begin, I want to give a brief overview of the Brinqa and Verisign partnership. Brinqa is a leading provider of unified risk management solutions across operations, assets, and individuals, resulting in a single assessment, monitoring, and reporting platform for IT risk. Verisign iDefense is a next-generation intelligence platform and API, with more than 18 years of providing actionable, relevant threat intelligence in context around vulnerabilities and cyber threats. The integration of these two technologies combines Verisign iDefense vulnerability intelligence, covering more than 45,000 software versions from more than 700 affected vendors, into a comprehensive solution with the Brinqa vulnerability and threat risk management, which is in combination designed to streamline vulnerability prioritization, remediation, and reporting. We have a great session planned for you today. There will be a Q&A session at the end, so please feel free to send us your questions through the webinar client, and we will try to get as many of those answered as possible. I will now turn it over to Jason for the first portion of our webinar.
Thanks, Hilda. Vulnerability management today continues to be a challenging and complicated task. With the increasing amount of malicious code and cyber attacks targeting vulnerable networks, users' hardware and software used in the global enterprise, an alarming amount of data breaches, financial loss, brand reputation, identity, and intellectual property theft are occurring. The game changers in cyber today include sophisticated attacks, new malware payloads, and changing attacker delivery methods, including zero-day vulnerabilities. For example, in January 2015, an Adobe Flash Player vulnerability, CVE 2015-0313, was integrated into the Angler exploit kit. Attackers used malvertising attacks to exploit the vulnerability. Victim website users were easily redirected to very popular sites, where they were ultimately led to an attacker-controlled site where the exploit was hosted. For instance, if you visited Forbes.com between the dates of September 8th through the 15th, 2015, chances are a malicious advertisement ran Angler and Neutrino exploit kit against your web browser. Today, exploit code is delivered via attacker-controlled websites and email attachments using social engineering tactics. Since the attackers are opportunistic, seeking low-hanging fruit, their attacks can be highly targeted and financially motivated, or espionage-focused, to establish a foothold and access over time. Exploit kits can target multiple vulnerabilities, including older vulnerabilities, end-of-life products, or new unpatched systems connected to the internet. Collectively, there were over 15 Adobe Flash Player vulnerabilities exploited by the Angler exploit kit between 2013 and 2015. One approach for organizations to help mitigate these risks is to establish a use case for applications that are known to add additional risk to an organization's enterprise. Since attackers are seeking a wider install base for vulnerable products they target, they will focus and target commonly installed components that have known vulnerabilities. Similar to the hardening practices for servers, less software and hardware to maintain equals better manageability for threats, vulnerabilities, and change management. For example, how many browsers does an enterprise user really need? Is Adobe Flash Player necessary for a user to do their job? Organizations need to scrutinize their third-party vendor hardware and software for weaknesses, updates, and rigorous support contracts. An effective vulnerability management program requires dedicated resources and additional resources as needed to plan, test, and deploy patches in a timely manner. Organizations need to make business-critical decisions quickly regarding patching or mitigation plans if a vendor patch is not available. Knowing in advance what assets are on the network, who are the responsible parties, and what is the criticality of these assets, their value and level of risk will help in response situations when there is an imminent threat. This approach will also help with prioritizing patching the various systems in the enterprise at different times. Core routing and switching, servers, workstations, and mobile, for example, will be patched at different cycles. Having standard operating procedures in place along with system security plans for all assets, ownership, and points of contact that will support patching. Automation tools and patch deployment tools can help. The coordination between teams and global locations can assist with the demands on staff and resources for an out-of-cycle emergency to patch. Companies today can afford businesses and brand reputation impact from a single successful cyber attack. In response to a zero-day vulnerability, there may be an impact to productivity depending on when patches are applied and if there is any downtime associated. There are methods for patching, for example, by failing over to backup servers while patching the other server without impact to production and services. This depends on the services and configuration. Having a change management plan, recovery plan, and business continuity plan in place are essential for a successful patch management for the unknowns, just in case something goes wrong. Change management is for all system administrators and engineers who manage and touch the systems so they know what has been done to the system to date. After all, managing just one major vulnerability can easily reach 6 figures. Understanding the following components of vulnerability intelligence will help an organization prioritize their efforts to mitigate the threat and risk to their enterprise. Research the threat history by examining intelligence collected from similar past attacks. Are there common attack methods that a threat actor or group utilize? Understanding adversary tactics, techniques, and procedures, or TTPs, along with past known incidents can help feed into determining the best defensive measures to start with. Consume all cyber intelligence available through public and or private sources. Consider targeted sectors and particular assets targeted. Information sharing with a particular sector or vertical is critical to assessing the threat quickly. For instance, the Financial Services Intelligence Sharing Center and the financial sector member, or the retail ISAC and member retailers, are sector-specific examples where membership has its privileges and it's all about the information sharing. Examine vulnerabilities and exploits affecting your employees, customers, and B2B partners. Partners, vendors, or anyone with authorized access to your enterprise network will add additional risk to your connected environment. Auditing, monitoring, knowing the W's, what, where, and what, when, and why, can prevent accidental incidents associated with those relationships. For example, vendors bringing their own hardware into your environment, laptops, USB drives, smart devices, may require network segmentation and monitoring for network access. Monitor and escort all visitors accessing only the equipment and resources necessary to complete the task. Numerous sources, vendors, and bug bounty programs can provide insight into vulnerabilities exploited in the wild, requiring a centralized collection grid. This is where the value of a threat intelligence provider like iDefense can augment your intelligence collection grid by combining and collecting these sources in advance of the need for more information. iDefense maintains its own vulnerability contributor program for privately held zero exploit code and advanced notification of zero-day vulnerabilities. So iDefense will first create a report to its customers while notifying the affected vendor for resolution. And what this is providing customers a proactive security approach by applying mitigations and countermeasures against potential exploitation of the zero-day vulnerability. Understand the context of the threat, asset inventory, and location of vulnerable components on the network. What is the access complexity and availability of exploit code? Is there active exploitation in the wild? If so, what are the methods? iDefense is actively plugged into this type of awareness. Who are the actors associated with the vulnerabilities and attacks? Attribution history is essential for predicting an adversary's next move and for implementing the right mitigations. What are the known indicators of compromise? IP addresses, domains, hashes, and URLs. These are all IOCs that can help identify malware. What defense countermeasures and mitigation steps should we take? As data scientist Michael Reutman said in his 2014 Black Hat presentation, fix what matters, know which vulnerabilities put you most at risk. Track the vulnerability lifecycle from the initial discovery until a fix or patch. By doing so, you can follow the threat over time and act accordingly based on availability of publicly available exploit codes, active exploitation in the wild, mitigations and countermeasures, and the availability of a vendor fix. For vulnerability tracking, iDefense covers over 890 vendors in its collection grid, along with hundreds of open source security advisory pages, exploit sites, security mailing lists, blogs, and Twitter feeds. By compiling this open source intelligence, this allows us to follow the entire life cycle of the vulnerability and report this out to our customers to help prioritize their asset management patching. When choosing among mitigation options, you want to ask the following questions and determine your situation. First and foremost, is there a patch available? If so, deploying a patch is going to be the best option to ensure you are protected against a vulnerability. However, you will want to consider things such as no negative impacts with patching. Does the vulnerability require out-of-cycle patching, or will a workaround suffice until the next update cycle? So workarounds such as on server side, are there configuration changes to mitigate the threat? Or on the client side, one can configure web browsers security and use good browsing habits, no script plugins, and virus total checks on files and URLs. Some organizations use download stations to download and software, excuse me, to download software and attachments from the internet to scan and sanitize prior to accessing by a user workstation. Can the patch wait? If you're unable to patch, what is the potential risk of not patching? These are all general questions that enterprise organizations should ask to help determine the best mitigation option to meet their needs. Despite the scenarios I've mentioned here, vulnerability management today isn't mission impossible. For instance, roughly 85% of targeted attacks against critical infrastructure organizations, including those related to unpatched software, are preventable, according to US CERT. It's a matter of expanding your vulnerability management view, looking beyond patches to the overall security intelligence landscape, and having a business partner who can help. With that said, I'd like to hand it over to Syed from Brinqa, who can explain just how Brinqa's solution can help with assessment and prioritization of these critical threats. Syed?
Thank you, Jason. That was an excellent introduction into threat intelligence, and I think it really highlights why threat intelligence is crucial to doing a better job with vulnerability management. And we're definitely hearing that from our clients and also from our prospects, just in terms of programs that are doing a good job of incorporating threat intelligence into their overall vulnerability management programs, having a greater sense of confidence in their remediation efforts, and also in their communication to their board members. In the second part of this webinar, we're going to talk a little bit more about the vulnerability management problem. We're going to talk about why it's such a critical and crucial thing to address for InfoSec departments. We're going to look at a few common challenges that most organizations face with being able to effectively manage a vulnerability program. And we're going to look at how Brinqa sort of addresses this problem and the different components of the solution. And then finally, we'll look at a quick and brief demo of the solution, just so you can get a sense of how different things look in the solution. Before we sort of get into talking about vulnerability management, I do want to give you a quick overview of the Brinqa product landscape. I think the way that our platform and our applications are structured and designed, it really informs how we approach this problem. At Brinqa, really our core technology product is the Brinqa Risk Platform. And the Risk Platform is really a collection of services that deliver the functions necessary for addressing risk management problems. Problems such as how do you identify and represent the different entities that you need to monitor risk on, what are the relationships between these entities, what is the flow of information and risk between these entities, how do you get information from all the different systems and people inside your organization that you need to really populate these risk models, how do you manage the life cycle of entities like your tickets, your tasks, your assets, in this type of a framework, how do you represent different performance and risk metrics. So really these are the services that the platform provides, and they're encapsulated into a framework that is very much scalable and secure, that is designed to handle very large sums of data, our backend engine is a graph database called Neo4j. So again, really geared towards handling enterprise data, doing quick calculations on this data, and providing quick results. So when we define the applications, which are really the use cases or risk problems that we're addressing and solving, what we're doing is we're packaging these services and providing metadata that is responsible for a specific problem, or that is representing a specific problem. And to that end, we have 5 out-of-the-box applications, but again, that is by no means the limit of the problems that the platform itself can solve. However, the 5 main applications that we have currently available are vulnerability risk, which is what we're going to be focusing on today. So again, this application focuses on the prioritization of vulnerabilities for remediation, managing and governing the remediation process, and providing reports in terms of risk and performance metrics to key stakeholders. The application security risk application, again, a little bit similar in flavor in the sense that it sort of focuses more on application vulnerabilities, and it also has a governance component where essentially you can manage the life cycle of your applications that are being developed internally. So you can have your developers use this tool as a risk-based view of looking at the maturity of the applications. The IT risk application focuses on evaluating risk on technology and business assets. The vendor risk application looks at external interactions, essentially any third parties or vendors that your organization is using, and evaluating risk, again, based on multiple data points. And the risk analytics application is sort of a more generic analytics-based application, which makes it really easy for you to incorporate security data from different sources to create metrics and dashboards and reports. And all of these applications are form an integrated suite. It is a unified platform in the sense that if you're using multiple applications, then you can effectively use the results and analysis from one of these applications and feed it into any of these other applications as well. So specifically, talking about the vulnerability management application and how the platform allows us to address this problem, we can really break up the platform's functions into 3 main components. So the first would be the risk modeling capabilities of the solution. So again, we define the risk model that represents a vulnerability management problem from the ground up. So essentially, we're going and defining what a vulnerability object needs to look like, what are the different risk classifications and criteria that you should consider, fraud prioritization, how should your technology assets like your hosts and vulnerabilities be related to your business assets, things like your business applications, your business processes, and we'll talk a little bit more about why this is really important. But the key point here is that all of this is being done from the ground up. So there is no magic sauce here. There's no black box here. We're essentially going and defining these risk models that represent the problem, and that is what essentially any user of this application would apply. And sort of on the data aggregation and correlation side of things, once we define the risk model for vulnerability management, once we define all the entities that need to be evaluated and monitored, we then go to the different systems like your vulnerability monitoring systems, like your threat intelligence feeds, like your asset management and CMDB systems, and go and get all of this information, pull this information together in an automated and seamless manner to populate these risk models, and to do correlation and calculations on them. So again, if you have, let's say, multiple vulnerability monitors that you're using, how should that information be correlated together? If you're using tools from multiple vendors, how do you need to normalize that information to a uniform risk methodology? So all of this is sort of built into the solution, and again, it gives the users or administrators of these tools a lot of flexibility in terms of how they want to interpret this data that is coming in places. And then finally, developing key risk metrics, key risk indicators as reports and as dashboards that you can deliver very easily to your different stakeholders. So really making the task of doing this analysis and reporting this analysis as easy and as seamless as possible. So let's just talk a little bit about the vulnerability risk problem in general. So if you look at any of the industry reports, like the Verizon DBI report, like the Semantic Threat, Internet Threat Report, you will immediately see that there is definitely a lot of focus on vulnerability management. The Council for Cybersecurity lists it as one of the top 5 controls that organizations must implement effectively to be secure. And this is really reflective of the state of affairs as well. So if we simply look at the number of vulnerabilities being reported every year, we'll see that there is a very persistent trend of a very large number of new vulnerabilities being disclosed and being published every year. And this graph is a little misleading because the 2015 is not the entire 2015 cycle, but it's the trend continues. So we're continuing to look at thousands and thousands of vulnerabilities, new vulnerabilities that are being reported every year. And there are more scary statistics. I think the Semantic the Internet Threat Report says that there are 603 new malware pieces reported, created every minute. The DBIR report says that almost all vulnerabilities that are actually used for compromises are compromised more than a year after they were disclosed. So we're dealing with a lot of different challenges here. We're dealing with a large volume of vulnerabilities. We're dealing with very severe inconsistencies in terms of how these vulnerabilities are being analyzed inside of organizations, how they're being targeted for remediation, and how they're being monitored on a constant basis. So another really interesting analysis and sort of a flip side is looking at zero-day vulnerabilities. So 2014 was the year up until then where the maximum number of zero-day vulnerabilities were reported. I think 24 zero-day vulnerabilities were reported. And the top 5 of these vulnerabilities left organizations exposed for a total of 295 days. So really what that means is that if you're a security organization and you had these vulnerabilities, these 5 vulnerabilities in 2014, you were essentially exposed for 300 days out of 365 in the year. So scary statistic. And also, if we look a little bit deeper into these vulnerabilities, it really makes things more complicated. So the shell shock vulnerability, which was, or also known as the BAM, was a vulnerability that was discovered in a piece of code that was not changed for 25 years. So we're seeing a lot of different trends. Really what this tells us is that attackers are not just doing random campaign attacks anymore. They're not just sending things out to see what comes back. They're actually putting a lot of effort and investing in researching vulnerabilities. So they're looking for vulnerabilities that people have not considered yet, that will give them the most access to organizations' infrastructure. Another really scary thing that was reported was the speed at which these vulnerabilities were exploited. So both the Heartbleed and Shell Shock had massive spikes in compromises within hours of being disclosed, meaning that the attackers that we're dealing with are extremely well prepared. They're extremely well coordinated. And the 295-day statistic tells us that the vendors, the providers of these softwares and products, they're really simply not moving fast enough to counter these efforts. So all of this makes us nervous. Seems like a really dreadful situation. But there are things that we can do to control this, that we can do to address this and to improve our security. Before we sort of look into the solution, though, I do want to talk a little bit more about the main challenges that organizations currently face. So clearly, one of the biggest problems is data overload. We talk to organizations fairly frequently where they tell us that they're seeing millions of new vulnerabilities being reported every week. We have talked to people that say that they're seeing millions of new vulnerabilities being reported every day. So in the face of this magnitude and volume of vulnerabilities, the traditional approaches of having a team or a group of people sort of trying to understand and trying to analyze vulnerabilities as they come in is simply not sufficient. The numbers that we're dealing with make it necessary that we have automated processes in place to address these challenges. The changing attack landscape is, again, something that is really relevant and really important. Jason alluded to some of this in when he was talking about the way that all compromises can occur. And with respect to zero-day vulnerabilities, with respect to the exploit toolkits and malwares that are available out there, that is really something that has to be monitored on a continuous basis. That has to be something that is factored into our vulnerability management programs by default and not as an afterthought. And sort of building up on these problems is the lack of business context. So again, the lack of an understanding of where our technology assets lie, how they support our businesses, what they do to the daily running of an organization is really important in understanding how vulnerabilities should be addressed. A SEV5 vulnerability on a system that supports an application like the cafeteria menus in an organization is not as important as a SEV5 that supports, let's say, the ground floor trading at a financial institution. So we have to have that context available, and we have to have that context built into the prioritization that we're doing for vulnerabilities. Lack of intelligent prioritization is, again, sort of related to that aspect, but again, really focusing on the fact that we cannot use static classification methods for prioritization. So we cannot simply be looking at CVSS where scores are evaluated once when the vulnerability is disclosed and don't really look at the external criteria and external factors that really tell us what's going on in the world. So if there's a SEV1 vulnerability that suddenly becomes really important because there's an attacker that makes it central to the way that it's conducting campaigns, we have to be aware of this. We have to have this information built into our process. We have to have this reflected immediately. And compounding all of these problems is definitely the presence of a lot of manual processes within vulnerability management programs today. Manual processes for vulnerability prioritization, manual processes for analyzing what needs to be fixed, for creating tickets for remediation, for assigning them to specific individuals. All of this really leads to a significant gap to remediation. So that one statistic that said that 99.9% of vulnerabilities are actually, or compromises are done using vulnerabilities that were disclosed over a year ago, is sort of a consequence of this. Another related statistic is that in a study that was done for a fairly large number of organizations, they saw that, forget the actual remediation, the point from a vulnerability being notified or a vulnerability being discovered to it actually being assigned for remediation, assigned as a ticket, or assigned to an individual for fixing, even that gap is hundreds of days. So clearly, having manual processes in place is not the solution for dealing with these problems. So we have to do a really good job of having this built into the DNA of our programs. So just a really quick overview of the Brinqa solution. So again, we talked about some of these components separately, but put together, this is really what the solution looks like. Three main components of information. One would be your vulnerability monitoring solutions, so essentially your monitoring systems that are reporting information about your hosts, your assets, your vulnerabilities, bringing that in to an analytical platform in an efficient manner becomes a very, very important task. And again, when we're talking about millions of vulnerabilities every day or every week, this is not a trivial task. So we want to make sure that this is as seamless as possible. The second aspect is your internal, is the sources of your internal risk and internal business classification. Again, connecting to your CMDB systems, connecting to your HR systems, connecting to your internal databases where this information lives becomes really important. And the reason why this problem becomes a little bit more complicated is that typically within organizations, this information is not available in one system. So what we're talking about is really going to multiple systems that maybe have part of the information and bringing that in. So we can correlate that information to the technology asset and vulnerability information that we're getting from our scanners. And finally, the third and really important component is the threat intelligence component. So again, the things that Jason was talking about, the ability to look at how a vulnerability is being exploited in the wild, how people are actually using a vulnerability to affect a compromise. And bringing all of this information together, again, in our case, using the risk platform to make sure that all of this information is brought into a single place effortlessly, seamlessly, and then we're doing all the things that we need to do to analyze this information correctly. So we're normalizing this information to a uniform risk framework. We are correlating information based on certain associations that exist in this data. We are augmenting this information through sources like CMDB and threat intelligence. And finally, doing our analysis on this information with the goal to prioritize what needs to be fixed. So really, that's what we're trying to get to, right? We're trying to get to a point where we have the most important problems that we need to fix at the top of our list, and managing the process for fixing these problems. So creating tickets and doing that in a manner that is seamless. So creating tickets automatically, creating tickets based on rules. Within organizations, it's fairly typical that there are multiple teams that are actually going to be responsible for fixing these problems that are being identified. So building in the intelligence, building in the rules for the creation of these tickets, for the remediation of these vulnerabilities, and managing that whole process, and then finally reporting to the different stakeholders, again, to the technology fields, to the technology teams, to the different board executives, to the C-level, and again, doing this in a manner which is automatic. You do not want resources to be allocated that are spending time on every cycle simply generating reports. So again, going all the way from the identification of a vulnerability to augmenting that data with business context, with threat intelligence, to the creation of tickets for remediation and reporting this information to the key stakeholders. That whole process is what the solution essentially encompasses. And the goal of the solution is to make all of those different components as seamless as possible. So just again, I'll do a quick overview and then we'll skip on to the demo. But the main components or the main functions that we're addressing here are we're modeling the problem. So we're creating the right risk model to address the vulnerability management problem. We're consolidating data from a lot of different sources. If you have multiple vulnerability monitors, if you have different vendors that you're using to scan the same parts of your organization, it becomes really important that you're able to set rules of priorities and precedents, bringing that information in, augmenting it with business context from your CMDB systems, from your internal systems, as well as from threat intelligence providers like Verisign, which are providing a lot of very useful information that we have to factor in. Analyzing this based on risk classifications that we have defined to prioritize vulnerabilities for remediation. And again, even at the remediation stage, building rules that make this whole process automated, that make this whole process as effective as possible, in the sense that you're minimizing your remediation effort and maximizing the risk reduction to your organization. And then finally reporting and communicating to the different stakeholders, and then doing this in a continuous manner. So doing this through means that do not require manual intervention, that are done entirely through rules and through automation that is built into the process. So I'll skip over the next few slides so we can get to the demo real quick. All right. So this is the Brinqa Vulnerability and Threat Risk Management application. Now, depending on the different entities that you're monitoring, this application might look a little bit different, but overall, the theme of the application stays very much the same. And what I mean by that is that in this demo that I'm going to walk you through, we're going to be looking at applications, and applications really represent the business context that I talked about. So that is the layer where we have created an association of the technology assets that are the hosts to your business assets, which are your applications. And we'll look at why it's really important to create that relationship clearly. We're also going to be looking at vulnerabilities and hosts, obviously, that are coming in from your vulnerability monitoring systems. We're going to look at how remediation can be handled in an automatic manner through a rule-based methodology that creates tickets automatically, that creates assignments automatically, that does SLAs automatically, and then we're going to also look at the remediation process itself. How do you manage tickets if you have multiple systems? How do you sort of bring all of that together? And then finally, reporting for risk. So it's really, really important that we are able to demonstrate the effectiveness of our efforts, and we're able to justify the effort that we're spending on coming up with these models. So the view that I'm at right now is sort of the program overview dashboard. So again, it really highlights some of the key metrics that we want to be monitoring. Things like what is the overall governance ranking of your program, what is the average vulnerability duration for the vulnerabilities that we're monitoring, what percentage of the hosts in our system are critical, what percentage of critical vulnerabilities have been remediated or are currently existing in the system, breakdowns of our technology assets, again, based on a lot of different cross-sections. So for instance, how are the different hosts placed with respect to their risk ratings when we're looking at them from an operating system point of view. Similarly, how can I break down the different hosts in my system based on the different locations that I might be monitoring, or again, based on the different asset tags that I might have in place. A quick list of the most vulnerable hosts in the system. Again, more breakdowns of the vulnerabilities in the system by category, by the different vendors that are responsible for these vulnerabilities, by the different products that these vulnerabilities are found in, quick distribution of the different vulnerabilities in the system. So again, when we start evaluating the vulnerability for prioritization, we start from a static model like CBSS, but by applying business context and by applying threat intelligence, the distribution of the vulnerabilities essentially changes to one that is more realistic and that better reflects the state of preparedness that you need to be in. Quick breakdowns of the vulnerabilities by their status, by tickets by their status, and then looking at the business side of things as well. So again, which business assets, in this case applications, are most impacted, what are their different risk ratings, more breakdowns in terms of lines of business, in terms of the production applications, and so on. So what we'll do right now is we'll sort of start from the business layer, which again is represented by applications in this demo, and drill down all the way to the vulnerability and see how the different risk classifications that we're evaluating and establishing are used in prioritization. So when we talk about applications, or we talk about any business entity that you're mapping to your technology assets, it becomes really important to establish the criteria for risk. So in this case, for instance, it's really important if you're monitoring applications to really have a good understanding of what these applications are and what they're doing for your organization. So are they internet-facing applications? Are these PCI-relevant applications? Is this a production application? What are the different impacts and ratings for this application? A lot of times we conduct risk assessments, so essentially questionnaire-based risk assessments to evaluate some of these things like system security rating, data privacy rating, the business or organizational impact of this specific application, the financial impact, the regulatory requirements and compliance requirements for this application. and we're coming up with risk ratings for these applications based on, again, either if this information exists in a system, we're pulling that information in, and if it doesn't, then we're conducting questionnaire-based assessments that essentially the owners or the main responsible people for this application are going to be coming in and providing responses to, that we're evaluating these ratings based on. We're obviously going to be coming up with a vulnerability rating because that is the main security data that we're monitoring in this model. We would also be looking at web application security ratings if you have that module incorporated into your instance. And based on that, we're coming up, of course, with risk ratings for these applications, and we're also transferring that to its associations. So this specific application is related to these three hosts. If we look at the host level, which is, again, an entity that is being reported by the vulnerability monitoring system, we'll see that we're sort of carrying that relationship forward. So we're keeping an eye on what application or applications are supported by this host. What is the risk rating for that application? What is the business criticality and business risk for this host based on its different associations? Some quick metrics about what is the average vulnerability duration for vulnerabilities related to this host, trends of vulnerabilities and tickets associated with this host, and then finally the actual vulnerabilities that exist on this host. So we're going to look at one of these vulnerabilities to sort of see the different metrics or measures that we're monitoring. So again, if you're familiar with CVSS, some of these measures might be familiar to you, things like access vector, confidentiality impact, authentication impact, access complexity, and so on. But we are also looking at additional risk ratings. So again, the business risk rating that is inherited from its host, and additional risk ratings that are evaluated based on our integrations with threat intelligence providers. So again, looking at the popularity of this rating in the wide world, how popular is this vulnerability? How frequently is this being mentioned or used or talked about? Are there any existing malicious toolkits that are using this vulnerability as part of its stack? Are there any known threat actors that are using and conducting campaigns using this vulnerability? Are there any malware families that exist that use this vulnerability? Is this a zero-day vulnerability or not? So again, looking at risk factors from inside the organization through our associations to asset management and CMDB systems, and looking at risk criteria from outside the organization. So again, looking at threat intelligence such as zero-day ratings, such as threat actor ratings, such as malware family ratings. And based on all of this information, we're coming up with a final risk rating for this vulnerability. So again, just to sort of recap, I know that's a lot of information, but what we're trying to do is we're trying to get a better understanding of what this vulnerability is and why this vulnerability should be important to us. And we're trying to do that in the most dynamic way possible. So we don't just want to rely on static mechanisms like CVSS. We also want to look internally to see how our business organization is actually related to this vulnerability before we made that determination. We also want to look at threat intelligence from Verisign to evaluate all of these factors, to basically factor in how this vulnerability is actually being used in the wide world. And again, the reason why this becomes really important is we need to create this constant analysis model where we're factoring in information that we might not immediately be aware of. And we need to do this automatically. We need to do this continuously. So far we've sort of covered half the problem, so to speak. We've really looked at the prioritization side of things. We've looked at internal as well as external criteria to come up with a risk rating for these vulnerabilities. Now we're going to look at remediation. Just before that, though, I do also want to point out that it's really important for us to make vulnerability information as easily accessible as possible. So the way that we handle it is by providing sort of these quick filters in all of the list views which means that if you need to get to a specific subset of vulnerabilities, we want to make it as easy as possible for you to do that. So let's say you want to look at all the Windows vulnerabilities or vulnerabilities that exist on Windows hosts, and you want to look at all the vulnerabilities that have not had remediation planned for them. You can sort of do that through this type of an interface very easily and very quickly. All right, so let's talk about remediation. So up until now, we have incorporated all of the data from our different sources like threat intelligence, like our business context, like our CMDB systems, like our vulnerability management providers. And we have come up with risk ratings for these vulnerabilities. So we have prioritized which vulnerabilities are the most important for us as an organization to fix. And we have assigned those risk ratings and rankings. What we are going to do now is we're going to create an automated framework for assigning remediation. And the way that we do this is through a rule engine that essentially creates rules that are going to address vulnerabilities the moment that they are discovered. So, for instance, the SWOT assignment rule is a rule that is created to create tickets for all vulnerabilities that exist on high-risk hosts and vulnerabilities that have themselves been classified as critical risk, and it's going to assign SLAs to it. So it's going to give it a specific time to fix. It's going to assign it to a specific user called InfoSec SWOT, and it's going to do this by consolidating vulnerabilities into as few tickets as possible. So in this case, for instance, we're consolidating vulnerabilities based on host dimensions. So all vulnerabilities on Windows hosts of a specific flavor, let's say, that are critical, are going to be grouped together into a single ticket. So what we're really trying to do is we're trying to automate the process of ticket creation. You could also think about it as creating rules to govern the flow of vulnerabilities inside your organization. So you're creating rules upfront that are going to direct vulnerabilities from the moment that they're discovered to exactly the right people that have to work on these vulnerabilities. And you're going to again assign SLAs in terms of remediation, in terms of response, right at this step. So you're not really doing this after the fact. You're setting up these rules initially. And the way that we usually create these rules is we create the most important rules up front. So you'll notice an evaluation order every time a sync happens to your vulnerability monitoring systems. All of these, any rule that is enabled will run automatically. And what you want to do is you want to create your most important tickets up front, because those are the most specific tickets, and then sort of trickle down all the way to the less important vulnerabilities. And again, if you're an organization that has, let's say, 10,000 vulnerabilities, you might want to fix them all. But if you're an organization that has 100 million vulnerabilities, you might not be so interested in fixing all of them. You might be more interested in fixing only the vulnerabilities that are most important, and making sure that your remediation efforts are directed in the best way possible. So, for instance, you could also, let's say, create another rule that assigns that creates tickets for critical vulnerabilities on a specific type of assets, let's say hosts that have the tag global assets, and you might want to assign it to a different team. You might want to assign a different SLA to it. And again, so if we go down the list, that's sort of what we're doing. We're going from the most important vulnerabilities to be addressed to the less important and more generic use cases. And you can do this for essentially any attribute of a vulnerability or a host. So you could do this for, let's say, you could create separate rules to address vulnerabilities on your external networks. You could do this for specific operating systems. You could do this for specific types of vulnerabilities. So it really gives you a lot of power in terms of how you want to control the flow of vulnerabilities within your organization. So just real quick, I'll go through what the different factors sort of look like when we create these rules. So enable this simply, do you want this rule to be run every time the sync happens, or do you want to run this automatically, manually? What evaluation order do you want this rule to run in? How do you want to manage the ticket? So again, in the solution, we have our own ticket management built in, which means that if you want to manage the lifecycle for these tickets in Brinqa, you can do so. But a lot of times organizations already have ticket and task management systems like Jira, systems like ServiceNow and Remedy. And if you already have processes around these systems in terms of remediation and policies and so on, you can also use Brinqa to sort of create these rules, but then push these tickets out to these external systems if you want to manage the lifecycle externally. What subset of vulnerabilities do we want this rule to target? So again, you can create rules based on vulnerability attributes. Let's say we want to create a specific rule to address zero-day vulnerabilities, and we want to create this rule to address only Windows systems. And then finally, do we want to group these vulnerabilities into tickets? So do we want to try to minimize the effort required for remediation by grouping vulnerabilities together? We could, for instance, say that, yes, I want to group vulnerabilities based on both vulnerability and host attributes. So let's say based on a specific CVE ID or a host dimension like a business risk. And then finally, what SLAs do I want to assign to this specific ticket? Who do I want to assign this ticket to? Do I want to assign these tickets to the owners of the hosts, or do I want to assign it to a specific user? You can also assign user groups here, things like mailing lists and so on. How do I want to assign the priorities for these tickets? Most common, average, highest, or static. And then finally, an SLA in terms of how much time I have to fix these vulnerabilities. So again, very powerful in the sense that it gives you a lot of freedom for how to manage vulnerabilities once they are identified in your system. So we look at a few tickets real quick, just to sort of contrast the difference. So this is a ticket that was created again as a result of the SWOT rule, which is addressing all vulnerabilities of a risk rating critical on hosts with a risk rating high. It's grouping them by operating systems. So you'll notice that there are multiple vulnerabilities that are grouped together in this ticket. It is created based on the SWOT rule. And in this scenario, since there is no external ID, we're actually managing the life cycle of the ticket in the tool itself. So you could, if you're familiar with something like Jira, it looks and feels very similar. You can start progress. You can remediate a vulnerability, remediate a ticket. You can request for an exception. You can request for risk acceptance and so on. Or alternatively, you could have tickets being managed externally. So for instance, any of these tickets that have an external ID associated with them are essentially being managed, in our case, in our local Jira instance. So there is no workflow associated with these tickets in our tool. However, any actions that you take in the external system, which is Jira or Remedy now or ServiceNow, all of those will be visible in this interface. So again, you can, if you have, let's say, multiple tools that you're using for ticket and task management, you can use this interface as a central monitoring and reporting facility as well. All right, so I know we're running out of time and we want to keep some time for Q&A. So just real quick, we have a few different ways in which we present reports. This format is more of a report template format, which means that we have defined a lot of different reports up front. And then when you're actually rendering or running these reports, you can really come into this interface and sort of drill down into the specific data set that you want to generate this report for. Let's say I want to create this report for only internet-facing applications which have a risk rating of medium or high. I can sort of do that here, or I can generate this report for the entire data set in the system. And again, you can do this for all the reports in the system. We have reports that cover your different ticketing systems, your different assets like your applications, your hosts, like your vulnerabilities. Again, similar interface to the one that we had looked at in the list view. All right, so I think I'll stop at this point, just to make sure we have some time for Q&A.
Okay, Syed and Jason, thank you very much for that insight. Appreciate that. At this time, I'll remind attendees that you can submit your questions via the question box in your webinar window. And I do have one question that's come in for Jason. And Jason, this person has a question regarding, let's see, what can be done if a patch cannot immediately be deployed for a vulnerability that is being actively exploited?
Sure, I can answer that. So, this often happens with a lot of our customers because, obviously you can't just, in some cases, you can't just simply roll out a patch, especially if you're dealing with, thousands, if not tens of thousands of servers or client stations. So, what we'll do for our customers is, in the event that the vulnerability is being exploited actively in the wild, say by malware, we're able to provide our customers with IOCs to identify the malware present, whether or not the malware is present within their network. So they'll basically take this intel, usually put it into their SIM so that they're alerted that in the event that in the event that malware is spotted within their network. Also, if available, apply mitigations to protect against exploitation is obviously another great way to kind of protect yourself. Also, implementing countermeasures such as signatures, whether that be IDS or Yara, depending on what you're running within your enterprise. For the purposes of detection, that's also another method to kind of help protect yourself until you're able to roll out a patch.
Great. Thank you, Jason. We have come to the end of our hour. I would like to thank our panelists, Syed and Jason. This concludes our webinar. Thank you all for attending today's session.